Berlin, 1918. The war had ended, but the city looked nothing like victory. Streets were hollow, buildings scarred with bullet holes and blackened by fire, and the hospitals, every single one, groaned under the weight of the broken men who returned home. Wards overflowed with soldiers missing limbs, coughing blood, or staring blankly at ceilings as if their minds had never come back from the trenches. Amid the chaos of shattered lives and a nation gasping for stability, a peculiar case emerged from the Couldn hospital, one that would haunt every doctor, priest, and witness who encountered it. It began not with the roar of artillery or the clash of soldiers, but with two silent children. Their names were Emil and Otto, identical twins of only 9 years. They were discovered after their mother's sudden and mysterious death. Her body was found in their home, lifeless and marked by strange burns on her hands, as though she had grasped fire that left no scorch upon the room around her. The twins were seated beside her, calm in their grief, eerily synchronized in their stillness. Both boys stared ahead with unblinking eyes, neither crying nor speaking, yet their breathing rose and fell in perfect rhythm, as though one body was split into two fragile vessels. At first, doctors thought the boys were in shock. Silence was expected after such loss. But what unsettled the staff was not their quiet, it was the way they reacted to the world. When Emil blinked suddenly, Otto winced as if struck by a sharp light. When Otto pricked his finger on a splinter of wood, Emil hissed in pain, though his own skin was untouched. One boy brushed against a candle's flame, and the other screamed, clutching at an unburned hand. Nurses whispered that they shared not just emotions but nerve, flesh, and soul. Some hailed it as a medical marvel, evidence of the mind's uncharted depths. Others muttered in fear, calling it a curse, punishment for sins untold. Priests argued late into the night over whether their unity was divine, a holy sign of connection, or the devil's mockery of creation. The German press, careful under the watch of a fractured government, hinted at rumors of hidden experiments, of children molded by war's cruel machinery. Psychologists offered clinical terms: mimicry, hysteria, trauma bonding. Yet none of these explanations sat comfortably beside the living proof in front of them. What were Emil and Otto? Were they merely victims of tragedy, bodies tied together by a grief too deep to measure? Or were they something the world was never meant to see, an anomaly that blurred the line between flesh and spirit, between fact and superstition? This is their story, the tale of two children who unsettled science, confounded faith, and whispered of the possibility that some truths cannot, and perhaps should not, be explained.
Every mystery begins not with the event itself, but with the soil from which it grows. To understand Emil and Otto, the strange twin brothers who baffled Berlin in 1918, one must first descend into the world that shaped them, a fractured household, a mother caught between survival and superstition, and a society itself torn between science and shadow. Their origin is neither purely ordinary, nor wholly extraordinary. It is the very tension between the two that makes their story so haunting. The war had swallowed men by the thousands, and their father was among them. Official reports listed him only as missing in action, another faceless casualty of the Western Front. Whether he died in a muddy trench, beneath collapsing earth, or as a nameless prisoner in some forgotten camp was never determined. His absence created a vacuum in the household, leaving his wife, Greta, to fend for herself and her two sons in a city drowning in hunger, rationing, and despair. Greta was not wealthy, not educated beyond the basics, and though she sought help from the Lutheran parish, whispers suggest she also turned elsewhere, to old folk practices whispered by women in the poorer quarters of Berlin. In every war-torn city, necessity often blurs into desperation. Neighbors recalled seeing her carry sprigs of dried herbs, chalk markings on her doorstep, and once, perhaps most damningly, burned candles at a crossroads where children were warned not to play. Some dismissed these as harmless superstitions, little rituals of comfort for a grieving widow. Others whispered darker interpretations, that Greta sought forbidden knowledge, bargaining with powers that might protect her children when the world seemed to conspire against them. In a Germany shaken between Enlightenment science and lingering medieval fears, Such whispers stuck easily, and soon Greta's name was coupled with muttered words like hexy, witch. Then came her death, a scene that remains chilling not because of its gore but because of its inexplicable nature. Greta was discovered on the floor of her small apartment, her hands blackened as if burned from within, not without. There were no flames, no scorched wood, no smoke in the air. And yet the skin of her fingers and palms was crisp, brittle, almost charred. Doctors offered no clear explanation. A kerosene lamp accident, some guessed, though there was no spill or soot. A rare infection, others suggested, though none could cite one that matched the evidence. And while speculation grew, two small figures remained at the center of it all. Emil and Otto, barely 9 years old, were found kneeling beside her body. They did not scream. They did not call for help. Instead, they wept without sound, their bodies trembling in unison, their hands clutching one another's as though anchoring against a tide no one else could see. When neighbors entered, the boys turned their heads simultaneously, eyes swollen and red, mouths moving but producing no sound. To the villagers who crowded the stairwell, it seemed less like two children crying, and more like a single grief channeled through two fragile vessels. The coroner's report, thin as it was, classified Greta's death as undetermined cause, and the twins were taken first to a parish orphanage and then, when their strange behavior became too unsettling, transferred to the Charité hospital for further observation. But even before the medical world could claim them, the village had already marked them with a name: Hexenkinder, witch children. The term carried centuries of weight. Folklore across Germany spoke of cursed twins, children born under ill omens, vessels for spirits, or bearers of inherited sins. In older villages, a child born with a caul over the face, or one who survived despite a stillborn twin, was regarded with suspicion. To have two children so eerily alike, whose behaviors mirrored unnervingly, was often seen as a sign of fate's interference. Emil and Otto embodied this dread. To those who had seen them at their mother's side, they were not simply orphans. They were evidence that something unnatural had been brewing long before Greta's final breath. Yet science, of course, offered its counter-arguments. Psychologists at the time spoke of trauma-induced behaviors, of selective mutism arising from grief, of mimicry as a coping mechanism in twins who clung to each other when the adult world had failed them. Doctors suggested malnutrition and stress could explain their pallor and silence. After all, Germany in 1918 was starving. Children with hollow eyes were not uncommon in Berlin's streets. Why then should Emil and Otto be seen as anything more than victims of circumstance? But rationality has always struggled against the weight of myth. For every doctor's note on selective mutism, there was a villager's story of shadows moving in Greta's windows when no candles were lit. For every medical theory of trauma, there was a whispered tale of Greta's burnt hands and how she had once been seen at midnight, kneeling in prayer not in church, but in the ruins of a bombed-out building, as though communing with something unseen. It is here that the contrast between innocence and dread becomes unavoidable. Emil and Otto were by every measure innocent children. Thin, pale, eyes wide with confusion, they clung to each other because they had no one else. And yet to those who looked upon them they radiated unease. Not because of what they did, but because of what others believed about them. They became projections of fear, vessels for war-torn imaginations, scapegoats for anxieties that science could not soothe and religion could not contain. Consider the ancient Germanic myth of Zwillingsbund, the twin bond curse. In these tales, twins were said to share not only blood but fate, tied so completely that one's suffering echoed in the other. Some stories described them as gifts of the gods, capable of channeling visions. Others painted them as omens, their shared souls a sign that balance had been broken. To many in Berlin's poorer quarters, Emil and Otto seemed to embody this legend, walking proof that the myths were not merely stories, but warnings. The paradox deepened when priests became involved. Some within the Lutheran Church called for the twins to be blessed, arguing that their uncanny connection might be evidence of divine mystery, a symbol of unity in a fractured time. Others saw only corruption, insisting that such unnatural mirroring could only be the devil's trickery. In one recorded sermon, a pastor declared, "The devil imitates creation to mock God. When you see one soul stretched into two bodies, do not marvel, it is mockery, not miracle." In this climate, Emil and Otto were no longer simply two boys. They became battlegrounds upon which larger forces waged their struggle. Science versus superstition, religion versus folk belief, rationality versus fear. Each faction claimed them, and in doing so, stripped them of the one thing they desperately needed, the chance to be children. What makes their origin so chilling is not only the ambiguity of their mother's death or their own eerie behavior, it is how quickly society rushed to explain them, to categorize them, to turn them into symbols of something beyond themselves. To the rational, they were medical anomalies. To the fearful, they were cursed. To the grieving, they were omens of a broken world. And to Emil and Otto themselves, perhaps they were simply lost boys, caught in the storm of meanings imposed upon them. Still, one detail cannot be erased: the image of their mother's blackened hands. Doctors filed it as unexplained. Neighbors whispered it was the price of a pact gone wrong. Some claimed Greta had tried to break whatever bond tied her sons, and in doing so, was consumed by the very force she sought to resist. Whether true or not, that image lingered in memory long after official records had faded. Blackened hands, silent children, and a city unwilling or unable to decide whether it had witnessed tragedy, miracle, or curse. Thus the stage was set. Emil and Otto entered the care of medicine, but not even the walls of Charité Hospital could insulate them from the whispers that followed. Their origins were steeped in contradiction: ordinary poverty and extraordinary myth, maternal devotion and suspected witchcraft, innocence and dread. And as Berlin itself struggled to reconcile its past of superstition with its present pursuit of science, these twins became living embodiments of that very struggle. They were not merely children, they were questions made flesh. And questions, especially the ones that resist answers, are the most dangerous inheritance of all. The first signs of strangeness within the walls of Charité Hospital did not arrive with a thunderclap, nor with the spectacle of ritual. They arrived quietly in whispers, in half-forgotten shifts, in the glances of tired nurses who at first thought their exhaustion was playing tricks. The hospital itself was no stranger to suffering. Its wards carried the broken remnants of the war: men without legs, soldiers coughing up the last of their lungs, children with hollow eyes from hunger. But amid this familiar devastation, there was something about Emil and Otto that unsettled even those who thought they had seen everything. The boys were placed in a modest ward, separate from the other orphans, under observation. At first their behavior seemed simple enough. They sat together on their small iron-framed beds, often holding hands, rarely speaking, and never apart for more than a few seconds. Doctors noted their silence, their synchronized movements, their tendency to glance at the same object simultaneously, as if receiving some invisible cue. Yet silence was not unusual in children traumatized by war. What unnerved the staff was how their silence seemed to infect the room around them. Conversations dimmed when people entered. The sound of footsteps seemed muffled. Even the electric lamps hanging overhead flickered when the boys looked up at them, though the engineers could find no fault in the wiring. The first recorded incident occurred with Sister Annalisa, a young nurse barely 19, new to the hospital, and determined to prove herself. She was assigned to bring water to the boys. According to her later testimony, she felt fine until she stepped across the threshold. There, just as she approached their beds, her vision blurred. The air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as though she were walking into a room filled with invisible smoke. She managed only a few steps before the jug slipped from her hands and shattered against the floor. Moments later, she collapsed. When she was revived, trembling and pale, she insisted she had not fainted from fatigue. "It was as if my chest was being pressed down," she whispered. "As if something in that room wanted me gone." Her colleagues laughed at first, attributing it to nerves, to overwork. But 2 nights later, another nurse, older, more experienced, reported the same sensation: dizziness, a sudden shortness of breath, as though the very air refused her entry. Within days, the stories spread through the hospital. Staff began to take turns avoiding the ward, inventing excuses, trading shifts so they would not be forced to linger near the twins. Then came the case of Dr. Weber, a seasoned physician who prided himself on rationality. He scoffed at the rumors and insisted on conducting a routine examination himself. Notes from his assistant describe how Emil and Otto watched him approach, their dark eyes fixed upon him without wavering. He asked them to open their mouths, to breathe deeply, to lift their shirts so he might listen to their hearts. They obeyed in silence. Nothing appeared unusual until he leaned closer, attempting to measure their pupils in the lamplight. At that precise moment, both boys stared directly into his eyes. What happened next remains debated, but according to multiple witnesses, Dr. Weber froze, his face pale, and then collapsed to the ground. His assistant rushed to his side and found him breathing but unresponsive, his body trembling in spasms. When he awoke hours later, He claimed to remember nothing beyond the moment of their gaze. Officially, the incident was attributed to exhaustion and stress. Unofficially, whispers spread that the twins had done something to him. Something wordless, unseen, but devastating all the same. Some staff avoided him after that day, as if his collapse had marked him, tainted him, aligned him too closely with whatever force lingered in those children. But the most chilling reports came not from fainting or collapses, but from the strange synchronicities of speech and movement. One nurse swore that she saw Emil lean forward slightly and whisper something, too soft to catch. At that very instant, Otto's lips moved in perfect synchronization, repeating the words though no sound emerged. To her horror, she realized Otto's expression mirrored Emil's exactly, down to the twitch of a muscle, the tilt of the head. It was as though one spoke through the other, she wrote in her notes. And I wondered if either of them had a voice of his own. Or if both were fragments of some other voice we were not meant to hear. Not long after, a young orderly named Carl made the mistake of mocking them. Frustrated by their silence, he sneered at the boys, clapping his hands near their faces and muttering cruel jests about dumb animals. Witnesses later recalled that Emil did nothing but blink slowly. Otto, however, turned his head sharply and stared at Carl with an intensity that unsettled even the other staff in the room. The next morning, Carl was found in the infirmary bed convulsing violently. His seizures came in fits, his limbs jerking in rhythms disturbingly similar to the odd twitches sometimes seen in the twins' sleep. He survived, but the seizures recurred whenever he attempted to approach their ward again. Soon, he refused to enter the hospital at all. Rumors spread with predictable speed. Within weeks, the staff whispered that ailments could be transferred merely by being near Emil and Otto. A nurse complained of migraines that began only after passing their door. Another claimed to dream of drowning after accidentally brushing against Emil's hand. Patients in nearby wards complained of chills, of heavy air, of feeling watched when the boys stared from their beds. Whether these were symptoms of hysteria or something more insidious, no one could say. But the effect was the same. The ward grew quieter, darker, avoided. The priests came next. Word of the twins' strangeness reached beyond the hospital walls, and a local parish dispatched 2 young clergymen to bless the halls. They walked the corridor with crucifixes and incense, muttering prayers in Latin. The staff watched nervously, grateful for any intervention. Yet even the priests returned pale. One admitted privately that when he lifted his cross before Emil, the boy tilted his head as though listening, and Otto's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. It was, the priest said, a smile too old for a child, a smile that seemed to recognize me. He did not elaborate further, but he never returned to the hospital again. Science struggled to maintain its composure in the face of these events. Psychologists argued vigorously that what the staff experienced was mass suggestion. In a hospital already heavy with grief, hunger, and exhaustion, they claimed, even minor oddities could spiral into hysteria. If one nurse fainted, another would soon expect to faint as well. If one reported a strange dream, others would echo it unconsciously, amplifying the myth until it gained a life of its own. The twins, silent and uncanny, became screens onto which the anxieties of the hospital were projected. There is no curse, one doctor declared. There is only fear, and fear is the oldest infection of all. And yet the counter-argument lingered stubbornly. Fear alone does not blacken hands, as with Greta. Fear alone does not make 2 children whisper in unison, nor collapse a physician in the middle of his examination. If hysteria explained all, why did so many symptoms manifest physically, leaving bruises, fevers, seizures? Why did those who mocked the boys most directly seem to suffer the worst? For those inclined toward the supernatural, the answer was clear. Emil and Otto were not merely children. They were conduits, parasites of the soul. Whether intentionally or not, they drained from those around them, feeding on energy, health, sanity. Some suggested they were not victims at all, but predators wearing the guise of innocence. Others argued they were cursed, doomed to inflict suffering upon anyone who dared come too close, without will or awareness of their own power. Both views agreed on one point. To be near them was to risk something more than fear. By late 1918, the hospital staff began conducting quiet rituals of their own. Crosses were tucked under pillows, charms pinned discreetly inside uniforms, passages of scripture whispered under breath before entering the ward. Some refused outright. Patients begged to be moved farther away. Emil and Otto's presence transformed a place already steeped in suffering into something closer to a haunted space. The hospital director issued strict warnings against rumor and superstition, but the effect was negligible. By then, the legend of the twins had already escaped the confines of the Charité. Berlin's streets buzzed with stories of the boys who share one soul, of nurses collapsing, of doctors losing their minds. Each retelling grew darker, embellished, but always centered on the same kernel of dread. The twins were dangerous, not in the way of knives or disease, but in ways unseen, in ways science could not measure. Were the staff merely victims of exhaustion, carrying the psychological scars of war into their work? Or were they the first to glimpse a phenomenon that defied categories, an anomaly that blurred the boundary between biology and the supernatural? The truth remained elusive, suspended between rational explanation and whispered fear. But one thing became undeniable. Wherever Emil and Otto went, misfortune followed. And the list of victims, those touched, changed, or broken by their presence, was only beginning. The twins' presence at Charité Hospital had already unsettled staff and patients alike. But as months passed, the question of what precisely afflicted them became impossible to ignore. Physicians demanded explanations. Clergy demanded exorcisms. Folklorists demanded recognition of ancient myths resurfacing in the heart of modern Berlin. And hovering in the center of this storm sat Emil and Otto, small and silent, their dark eyes reflecting a world unable to agree on whether they were medical curiosities or harbingers of something supernatural. The first to seize authority were the neurologists. Charité had long prided itself on scientific rigor, and the rise of neurology in the early 20th century promised answers where superstition once held sway. Dr. Matthias Kruger, head of the neurological department, insisted that the boys were victims of psychogenic trauma, nothing more. To prove his point, he proposed a series of controlled experiments. His colleagues gathered in the observation room one gray November morning, notebooks open, pens poised, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and anticipation. The initial tests seemed designed more to impress an audience than to uncover truth. An assistant placed a block of ice on Emil's bare arm, while observers focused on Otto. At first, nothing happened. Otto continued to sit, his gaze fixed on the far wall. But then, almost imperceptibly, he shivered, his arm twitching as if mirroring the sensation. Coincidence, Kruger muttered, scribbling in his notes. The experiment was repeated, this time with hot water trickling onto Emil's skin. Again, Otto flinched seconds later, though he had not been touched. The room buzzed with uneasy murmurs. The next trial turned more invasive. A pin was pressed lightly into Emil's fingertip, drawing a bead of blood. All eyes shifted instantly to Otto. For a moment, nothing. Then Otto lifted his own hand, staring at the corresponding finger. No blood appeared, but he winced, withdrawing it sharply, as though he too had felt the prick. Some witnesses swore they saw his skin redden faintly, though others dismissed it as a trick of the lamplight. Kruger remained unsatisfied. He argued that twins often developed sympathetic reactions, a well-documented psychological phenomenon. Yet even he grew visibly unsettled when, during one trial, Otto began to cry silently the instant Emil was touched with the pin, tears sliding down his cheeks, though Emil's face remained curiously blank. The room fell into silence. One assistant muttered a prayer under his breath, earning a sharp rebuke from Kruger. But no amount of scolding could erase the unease that clung to the observers. Despite repeated attempts, the experiments yielded maddening inconsistency. Sometimes the twins mirrored each other perfectly, as though one body carried two nervous systems. Other times there was no reaction at all, leaving the observers frustrated and divided. Was it proof of a supernatural bond, or evidence that the supposed synchronicity was nothing more than selective observation, coincidence magnified by expectation? Kruger insisted the latter, but his colleagues were less certain. Outside the hospital walls, the story had already begun to take on a life of its own. Berlin's churches seized upon the twins as proof of divine punishment. In sermons, priests warned that tampering with fate through folk rituals, through sins of the flesh, through the savagery of war, could result in abominations like Emil and Otto. These children, one pastor declared, are not guilty themselves, but they bear the mark of a guilty age. Parishioners nodded gravely, crossing themselves when the twins' names were spoken. Some demanded the church intervene to perform rites of cleansing. Others feared even speaking of them aloud, lest their own households fall under shadow. Meanwhile, folklorists and occultists flooded the city with interpretations that ranged from scholarly to sensational. One compared the twins to the old Germanic myth of the Zwillingsbund, a cursed bond between siblings in which the suffering of one must always echo in the other. Another invoked the Norse concept of the Huger, a fragment of the soul capable of leaving the body, splitting or manifesting across more than one form. To them, Emil and Otto were not anomalies of neurology, but embodiments of ancient archetypes. They were living proof, argued one folklorist, that myths were not dead but merely dormant, waiting for moments of great upheaval to resurface. Among the most controversial theories came from a fringe psychoanalyst named Dr. Friedrich Adler, who suggested the twins were not supernatural at all but products of intrauterine trauma. According to Adler, their mother's rumored dabbling in rituals was irrelevant. What mattered was the womb itself. The violence of war, the famine, the psychic scars of grief, all of it, he argued, had imprinted upon the developing fetuses, welding their consciousnesses together in a way no science yet understood. They are not cursed, Adler declared in a lecture later transcribed by students. They are witnesses. Their very being testifies to the scars war can leave not only on nations, but on the unborn. His theory was ridiculed by his peers, but embraced by a small circle of progressive thinkers, who saw in Emil and Otto a symbol of the modern age's psychological wounds. As these debates raged, journalists descended like vultures. The Berlin press sensationalized the story, framing it as both medical mystery and gothic horror. Headlines spoke of the boys who share one soul and the silent children of Charité. Articles recounted exaggerated versions of fainting nurses, priests who fled in terror, and experiments that hinted at impossible phenomena. Public imagination ran wild. Some readers believed the twins were evidence of spiritual corruption. Others hailed them as symbols of a new science yet to be born. Either way, Emil and Otto became infamous far beyond the hospital walls. The clash between science and superstition only grew sharper. Rationalists scorned the priests, declaring the twins nothing more than traumatized children magnified into myth by hysteria. Clergy countered that science, in its arrogance, refused to acknowledge the obvious, that forces older than medicine were at play. Folklorists warned that dismissing ancient stories was dangerous, that myths carried truths science could not measure. And caught between these factions were two children who rarely spoke, who sat quietly in their ward while strangers projected their fears and theories upon them. For those who witnessed them directly, explanations mattered less than the visceral unease the twins inspired. Nurses reported that when they tried to record daily observations, their pens sometimes scratched out words they did not remember writing. Visitors claimed the ticking of clocks slowed in the ward, minutes dragging like hours. Even skeptics admitted that time seemed to behave oddly in their presence, though they insisted it was merely psychological. Yet the effect was undeniable. No one left the twins' ward unchanged. The broader question loomed: was this horror truly explainable through empirical means? Or was something older, stranger, and darker at work? Every attempt at certainty collapsed under contradiction. When science sought to pin the mystery down, it slipped through its fingers like smoke. When superstition claimed triumph, evidence surfaced that complicated the narrative. The twins seemed to exist precisely at the fault line between the rational and the irrational, forcing all who encountered them to confront the limits of their own beliefs. By 1919, Berlin was a city split between two worlds. On one side stood the laboratories, gleaming with instruments of measurement where men like Kruger demanded data and mocked the old faith. On the other side stood the churches, the occult societies, and the folk storytellers, who whispered that Emil and Otto were proof that curses lingered, that progress had not banished the old gods and demons. Between them, the twins became battlegrounds, their silence echoing louder than the arguments of either camp. And yet, perhaps the most chilling thought was not whether they were supernatural or scientific anomalies, but whether the categories themselves were too narrow. What if the truth did not belong wholly to science, nor wholly to superstition, but to some terrifying synthesis of both? What if Emil and Otto embodied a wound too deep for any single framework to heal, a scar of the human condition itself, born from war, grief, and something older that language could scarcely touch? The clash of interpretations left no resolution. Priests continued to bless the halls, doctors continued to measure, folklorists continued to speculate, and journalists continued to sensationalize. Through it all, the twins remained unchanged, their presence defying explanation, their mystery deepening with each attempt to unravel it. In them, Berlin confronted not just two strange children, but a reflection of its own fractured identity: modern yet medieval, rational yet haunted, scientific yet still bound by myth. And as the debate roared on, one truth lingered, undeniable and unsolvable. Whatever Emil and Otto were, they would not be dismissed. and their story had only begun. Time is supposed to heal wounds, yet those who once crossed paths with Emile and Otto spoke as though the twins had left scars no calendar could erase. Even decades after their confinement in Charité, the survivors' recollections trickled into letters, interviews, and whispered confessions, each testimony layered with the same haunting suggestion. The boys had reached into minds and dreams, leaving traces behind like fingerprints in dust. A nurse named Clara, who was only 19 when she tended to the twins, described her first night duty with them. She had been assigned to monitor their sleep, but at some hour past midnight she began to hear what she swore was humming. A lullaby, low and fragile, threading through the stillness. At first she thought it must be another nurse on rotation, yet the sound grew clearer, filling her head rather than her ears. The twins lay silent in their beds, their lips unmoving, but Clara recognized the tune as one her own mother had sung to her during childhood fevers. "It wasn't coming from the room," she later told an interviewer in the 1960s, her voice trembling. "It was coming from me, from inside me, like they had found something buried and made me hear it again." She carried that memory for decades, never quite certain if it was hallucination, suggestion, or intrusion, but certain of one thing: it had not been her own mind playing the song. Another account emerged from Father Albrecht, a priest summoned after hospital staff demanded spiritual intervention. He approached the task with confidence, armed with holy water, crucifix, and the authority of Scripture. Yet what he experienced fractured that confidence beyond repair. According to his diary, which scholars later uncovered among parish archives, he began the exorcism with the standard litany, commanding in Latin for any unclean spirit to depart. But as he spoke, his own words returned to him distorted, reverberating in the ward as though spoken back in chorus. He wrote that the echo carried two pitches at once, one high, one low, intertwined like threads of rope. "It was my voice," he scribbled in shaky ink, "and yet not my voice." As if mocked, as if multiplied, the twins did not speak, yet I heard myself twice over, broken into two tones. I fled before completing the rite. In the weeks following, Albrecht resigned from his parish duties, retreating to a monastery in silence. To his brethren, he never mentioned the hospital again. But the diary left behind painted him as a man forever shadowed by the impression that two children had fractured his voice into pieces. Patients too carried their memories, though many tried to dismiss them as dreams until they learned others had shared the same visions. One man recovering from pneumonia described vivid dreams of drowning, icy water rushing into his lungs, his arms thrashing in panic, only to awaken gasping in his hospital bed. He dismissed it as feverish imagination until a fellow patient confided the same dream in near-identical detail. Others whispered of fire, flames licking across walls, smoke curling into words none could understand, shadows shaped like children dancing at the edge of the blaze. What disturbed the patients most was not the intensity of their nightmares, but the synchronicity. Strangers, housed in the same ward as the twins, dreaming the same images night after night. Years later, some insisted these dreams had never left them, resurfacing during illness or grief like echoes from a chamber long abandoned. One of the most chilling testimonies came from an orderly named Carl, who in old age agreed to an anonymous interview. His hands shook as he recalled the incident, though decades had passed. He admitted that he once mocked the twins, frustrated by their silence, calling them phantoms under his breath as he cleaned their ward. That night, he dreamt of mirrors, hundreds of mirrors lined in a dark corridor, each reflecting not his own face but two boys standing behind him. They did not speak, but their eyes moved when he did, tracking his every step. When he reached for a mirror, it shattered into dust without sound, yet the image of the boys remained hovering in the air, still watching. Carl awoke screaming, convinced they had followed him into waking life. He quit medicine shortly afterward, turning to manual labor, claiming he had glimpsed something that feeds on mirrors, on reflections. His words became part of the oral folklore surrounding the case, repeated with shivers by those who studied the hospital archives. Even decades later, nurses who had tended to Emile and Otto admitted that their influence lingered in strange ways. One, named Lisbeth, testified in the 1950s that she still woke at night with the sensation of being observed. "I can feel them," she confessed, "like two sets of eyes in the corner of the room. Not watching with malice, just watching, as if I am still on shift, still responsible for them, though they must have been long dead." She described the feeling as less a haunting and more a tether, a bond that could not be severed even by time or distance. Psychologists who later interviewed her argued it was a textbook case of unresolved trauma, manifesting as lingering paranoia. Yet Lisbeth herself insisted the twins had left an imprint upon her, something deeper than memory, a residue that carried into her dreams and waking hours alike. The question, of course, was whether these testimonies represented psychological residue of war and exhaustion, or whether they pointed toward something genuinely uncanny. Trauma was rampant in post-war Berlin. Hallucinations, breakdowns, and dissociative episodes were common among civilians and medical staff alike. It would have been easy to attribute Clara's lullaby, Albrecht's echoing voice, and Karl's mirror dreams to minds cracked under pressure. But the similarities between their experiences raised questions that psychology could not easily dismiss. Why did multiple patients share the same imagery in dreams? Why did testimonies separated by decades echo the same motifs of being watched, mirrored, or intruded upon? And why did so many survivors describe the sensations not merely as memory, but as something ongoing? Something still active in their lives long after the twins themselves had vanished from the world. The uncanny detail of these accounts gave rise to new interpretations. Some folklorists suggested the twins acted as conduits, projecting fragments of their own consciousness outward into those around them. Others, steeped in occult traditions, believed Emil and Otto were not only sharing one mind, but consuming portions of others, weaving staff and patients into their strange mirrored bond. More conservative voices within the church whispered that the testimonies were evidence of possession spreading like contagion, attaching itself not only to the boys, but to anyone who crossed their path. In all these interpretations, one theme remained constant. Contact with Emil and Otto left people altered, permanently marked. The survivors themselves often struggled to explain their memories without resorting to contradiction. Clara, the nurse with the lullaby, admitted that part of her still believed it had been stress and fatigue. Yet another part whispered that it had been too precise, too intimate to be coincidence. Father Albrecht's diary revealed a man torn between faith and fear, unable to reconcile how Scripture had faltered before two silent children. Karl, the orderly, lived the rest of his life avoiding mirrors whenever possible, a superstitious habit he acknowledged as irrational, yet refused to abandon. Lisbeth, the elderly nurse, wept in interviews, confessing that she sometimes spoke aloud to the unseen watchers in her room at night, asking them to let her sleep. Each testimony was fractured, hesitant, and raw, yet woven together they painted a picture of two children whose influence extended far beyond their hospital beds. For those who heard these testimonies, the implications were chilling. Were Emil and Otto simply vessels of trauma, reflecting back the collective fears of a broken city? Or had they truly reached into the minds of others, knitting their own fractured consciousness into anyone who came near? The distinction mattered little to those who lived with the aftermath. What haunted them was not the question of how, but the certainty that something had happened. Something that changed them in ways no doctor, priest, or scholar could undo. And so the survivors' voices endure, echoing across decades, each account a thread woven into the tapestry of the twins' legend. Whether viewed as trauma, superstition, or supernatural intrusion, their testimonies resist erasure, resisting the rational explanations that sought to confine them. They remain the most unsettling evidence of all, that the twins' presence was not limited to themselves but radiated outward, leaving scars invisible yet indelible upon every soul they touched. When the story of Emil and Otto resurfaced in post-war scholarship, it was not as a matter of settled fact, but as an open wound, a case remembered more for its contradictions than its certainties. Historians sifting through scattered hospital reports and yellowing newspaper clippings noted how inconsistencies ran through every account. Dates that did not align, testimonies that shifted across time, official records missing or heavily redacted. For some, this proved the entire story was nothing more than exaggeration, a tale inflated by a city desperate for distraction after the war. Berlin in 1918 was a place of chaos, hunger, political unrest, and spiritual disillusionment. In that atmosphere, the appearance of two strange children, silent, unnerving, and bound by uncanny synchronicity, was fertile soil for rumor. To skeptics, Emil and Otto were simply twins afflicted by trauma, their story magnified by a society that needed monsters and miracles in equal measure. Yet as rational as that explanation sounded, it never quite accounted for the persistence of their legend. Others suggested the case was not merely exaggerated, but deliberately manipulated. In the fractured politics of the Weimar Republic, children like Emil and Otto could easily have been weaponized as symbols. Eugenics debates were already creeping into German discourse, fueled by the belief that certain traits revealed genetic weakness or degeneration. Some scholars argue that the twins became tools in these debates, cited as proof that defective lineage could spawn aberrations. Rumors circulated that government officials visited Charité not to cure the boys but to study them, debating whether they represented hereditary decline or a dangerous new form of mental contagion. If so, their story was less about mystery and more about propaganda, twins reduced to symbols of social fear. Yet again, records are too inconsistent to prove such claims, leaving historians arguing whether the boys were exploited by politics or simply consumed by folklore. Psychology, too, has tried to reclaim the twins as a case study, rather than a legend. In later decades, some neurologists pointed to the discovery of mirror neurons, cells that allow one individual to reflect the actions and emotions of another. Could Emil and Otto have possessed mirror neurons so hypersensitive that their bodies responded as though linked? Others proposed the diagnosis of shared psychosis, or folie à deux, a rare but documented phenomenon where delusions leap from one mind to another until both are trapped in the same distorted reality. According to this theory, the twins' experiences were not supernatural but psychological, a duet of madness reinforced by their identical appearances and inseparable bond. But even this explanation struggled when applied to testimonies beyond the twins themselves. How could folie à deux explain the dreams of drowning reported by unrelated patients, or the priest's echoing voice? Psychology could sketch possibilities, but none seemed to hold the entire picture. Where science left gaps, myth rushed in. Among Berlin's working-class neighborhoods, stories circulated that the twins were omens of death. Mothers warned children to stay away from graveyards at dusk, for two pale figures had been seen there, whispering silently to each other. In other tellings, Emil and Otto wandered near hospitals, appearing at windows before patients took their final breaths. These tales blended easily into older German folklore, where twins often carried ambiguous roles, at once blessed and cursed, gifted with second sight, yet doomed to bring misfortune. Emil and Otto slipped naturally into that symbolic framework, their silence transformed into a kind of spectral language, their mirrored movements a gesture of fate itself. By the 1930s, as Europe edged once again toward darkness, the twins' story became a cautionary tale retold in different forms. Some said their minds had never been separated, that their souls had fused into a single restless entity. Paranormal enthusiasts later claimed their presence lingered in the Charité ward long after their physical disappearance, manifesting in cold drafts, flickering lights, or the sensation of being watched. A few even argued the boys had transcended death, their consciousness wandering still, seeking completion, searching for others to draw into their bond. Ghost hunters who visited Berlin in later decades reported hearing children's footsteps in hospital corridors, long abandoned. Skeptics dismissed these as theatrics, but believers pointed to them as proof that Emil and Otto remained among the living in some spectral form. The twins also became figures of fascination among occult circles. Esoteric writers linked them to the concept of the doppelganger, not merely as doubles of each other but as mirrors of the human soul. To encounter them, one text warned, was to glimpse the fracture between body and spirit, to realize that identity itself was unstable. Another occult treatise described them as living sigils, embodiments of psychic wounds carved by war. According to this view, Emil and Otto were not accidents of biology, but manifestations of collective trauma, shaped not only by their own suffering but by the psychic weight of a city drowning in grief. Their existence was interpreted as symbolic proof that horrors of war could incarnate themselves into human flesh, leaving behind beings who blurred the boundaries of natural law. Meanwhile, modern folklore has continued to reimagine them. In some corners of the internet, Emil and Otto appear in creepypasta retellings, their story updated with grainy photos and fictionalized accounts designed to terrify a new generation. Posts describe shadowy figures captured in hospital windows, or recordings of faint lullabies supposedly traced back to the twins. Others frame them as early examples of psychic phenomena, precursors to parapsychology studies in the mid-20th century. What fascinates readers most, however, is not whether the stories are true, but how seamlessly they intertwine history with horror, creating a narrative too unsettling to dismiss entirely. Historians who attempt to debunk the myths often find themselves frustrated by the same paradox. The less evidence survives, the stronger the legend becomes. Records that might have clarified their fate, medical charts, parish notes, government archives, are either missing or so heavily altered that no certainty can be drawn. In that absence, the myths thrive. Rationalists point to this void as evidence of fabrication, while believers insist it is proof of suppression. If the truth were harmless, one folklorist remarked, why has it been erased? The very gaps become part of the story, inviting speculation that officials destroyed documents to conceal what could not be explained. And so Emil and Otto remain suspended between explanations. Were they exaggerated by a weary city, victims of hysteria amplified by newspapers hungry for sensation? Were they exploited as propaganda, symbols of degeneracy in a Germany teetering toward eugenics and authoritarianism? Were they medical anomalies, trapped in a bond of mirror neurons or shared psychosis? Or were they something older, something mythic? Omens, apparitions, souls forever divided and forever searching. Each theory carries its own weight, yet none closes the case. Rationalists argue myths are coping mechanisms, scaffolding erected around the incomprehensible. Believers counter that myths often hold fragments of truth, preserved in story when evidence cannot endure. Perhaps Emil and Otto were neither miracle nor curse but mirrors, reflecting the fears, hopes, and obsessions of everyone who looked upon them. Perhaps their silence was not emptiness but invitation, a void in which the world poured its need for meaning. What lingers is less the question of what happened in the Charité ward than the enduring certainty that something did happen, something powerful enough to etch itself into history and folklore alike. Whether born of neurons or nightmares, propaganda or possession, Emil and Otto have never truly left. They remain figures who haunt cemeteries, flicker at hospital windows, and wander through dreams. They remind us of the fragility of identity, the porous line between science and myth, and the uneasy truth that some mysteries grow stronger, not weaker, the more we attempt to solve them. And so their story persists, unresolved and unresolvable, a riddle of history, a whisper of folklore, a haunting that refuses to fade. To skeptics, they are symbols of human credulity. To believers, they are proof that souls can fracture and spill beyond their bodies. To the rest of us, they are simply Emil and Otto, two children born into a broken world, who left behind not answers, but echoes. The official story of Emil and Otto ends, at least on paper, in silence. In 1922, the hospital records that once contained their names simply stop. No burial sites were ever documented, no discharge papers survive, no photographs authenticated. The twins appear to dissolve from the administrative machinery of history itself, as though they were never there. For some, the explanation is bureaucratic. Germany in the early 1920s was a nation unraveling, its institutions overwhelmed by political upheaval, inflation, and unrest. Patients disappeared from ledgers all the time. Yet the absence of even the faintest trace, no parish record, no family claim, no autopsy, feels too precise, too deliberate, as though someone had worked to ensure that their existence could not be tracked. Whispered accounts suggest they were transferred in secrecy to psychiatric facilities on the outskirts of Berlin, places notorious for vanishing patients. Others claim the twins died together one winter night, inhaling and exhaling in perfect synchrony, their final heartbeat a shared moment no doctor could interrupt. The truth has been buried under time, yet fragments remain. Doctors' notes scrawled in margins, nurses' confessions trembling decades later, and folklore that refuses to loosen its grip. Psychology offers hypotheses, mirror neurons, shared psychosis, trauma woven into the womb, but no consensus. Religion frames them as warnings, reminders of what happens when souls fracture beyond human design. Folklore elevates them into phantoms, pale figures glimpsed near graveyards or hospital corridors long after their disappearance. Were Emil and Otto merely casualties of war's invisible wounds, fragile children bound by suffering and misunderstood by science? Or were they something altogether different, something that should never have crossed into our world, a consciousness too vast for a single body, cursed to fracture into two? Perhaps their story ended a century ago, their secret extinguished with their final breath. Or perhaps it lingers still, patient and silent, like a shadow just beyond sight, waiting for the moment when someone dares to look too closely. In the end, history leaves us with only a question. Not what happened, but what do you believe?